The sun was a merciless hammer in the New Mexico sky of 1873. It beat down on the baked earth until the very air shimmered, a hazy, molten glass that distorted the distant mesas into wavering specters. Nothing moved out here that didn't have to. The lizards stayed under their rocks, the snakes coiled in the shade of skeletal mesquite, and the buzzards circled high above, patient as God. On the dusty ribbon of a trail that passed for a road, a heavy freight wagon groaned its way west. It was pulled by 4 weary mules, their heads low, their hides dark with sweat. On the driver's seat sat a man named Silas, a round, talkative fellow whose monologue about a bad hand of cards in Santa Fe had long since been surrendered to the oppressive heat. Beside him, silent and still, sat Jedediah Callahan. Jed, as he was known to the very few people who had cause to know him at all, was a man built of long lines and hard angles. He seemed less a passenger and more a piece of the harsh landscape itself, weathered and unyielding. His shoulders were broad enough to block out a sizable portion of the sun, and his hands, resting on his knees, were rope-scarred and calloused, knuckles like river stones. He wore a canvas duster the color of the dust that covered it, a garment that had seen too many miles and too much weather. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that gave away nothing. It was a map of hard living, carved with lines that weren't from laughter. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on the horizon. But they weren't just looking. They were watching. It was a habit from a life he was trying to leave behind, a life where looking wasn't a passive act, but the primary tool of survival. He had been a soldier once, and other things after. Now, he was just a man guarding a wagon full of flour and bolts of cloth, seeking the kind of quiet that only a vast and empty wilderness could provide. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of hooves in the thick dust, the squeal of the wagon's axles, and the jingle of the harnesses. It was a hypnotizing, lulling symphony of monotony. Then, a new sound intruded. It was faint at first, a frantic, desperate rhythm that didn't belong. Jed's head turned slightly, a fractional movement that Silas didn't even notice. His gaze sharpened, scanning the shimmering heat haze to the south. Something was moving out there, a figure, small and dark against the blinding glare of the alkali flats. It stumbled, fell, and rose again, a frantic scramble of limbs against the indifferent landscape. It was running with the kind of desperate, lung-searing abandon that meant something was behind it. "Well, looky there," Silas mumbled, finally noticing the disturbance. "Some poor souls had a bit of bad luck with their horse." Jed didn't reply. His eyes narrowed, tracking the figure's trajectory. It was heading for them, not by chance, but with a purpose born of pure, animal terror. As it grew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman, or a girl. Really, she was young, her dress torn at the hem and stained with dirt, her hair a wild, sun-bleached tangle. She ran with her head down, her arms pumping, her feet kicking up plumes of dust that clung to her like a shroud. Jed felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his gut. This was trouble. It had the scent of it, the shape of it. Trouble was the one thing he had paid a high price to outrun. And here it was, running straight for him under the noon sun. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 30-odd years, was to tell Silas to whip the mules, to pass this person by and let the desert swallow her story. He had done it before. He had learned, the hard way, that other people's fights were sharp, and they had a tendency to cut the hands that intervened. But he stayed silent. He watched. The girl was closer now. He could see her face, streaked with grime and sweat, her mouth open in a silent gasp for air. He could see the whites of her eyes, wide with a fear so profound it was almost elemental. She wasn't just running from something. She was running for her life. She looked to be about 19, old enough to know the world's cruelty, but young enough to still be broken by it. She stumbled again, this time only 20 yards from the wagon. Her knee hit the hard-packed earth, and a raw cry of pain and frustration escaped her lips. For a moment, she stayed there, on her hands and knees, her shoulders heaving, defeated. Then she looked up, and her eyes met Jed's. In that instant, the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. He saw past the dirt and the torn dress. He saw the desperate plea, the last ember of hope in a soul that was about to be extinguished. She pushed herself up, ignoring the bloody scrape on her leg, and limped the last few feet to the side of the wagon, her hand reaching out to the rough sideboard. "Please," she gasped, her voice a raw, broken whisper. Her lungs burned for air, and each word was a painful effort. "Please, you have to help me." Silas pulled back on the reins, bringing the mules to a halt. "Whoa there, miss. What's the matter? You look like you've seen a ghost." The girl ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Jedediah. She had seen something in his stillness, in the quiet gravity of his presence, that Silas, with his easy chatter, did not possess. She saw a man who understood silence and shadows. She saw a wall she might be able to hide behind. "They're coming," she said, her chest heaving. "Men, they're hunting me." Jed's gaze flicked back to the southern horizon. He could see them now. 3 dark specks, growing larger. Riders. They weren't moving at a frantic pace. They were tracking, confident and unhurried, like wolves who knew their prey was wounded and had nowhere left to run. "Well now," Silas said, his voice laced with a nervous tremor, "we don't want no part in any trouble. Miss, we're just hauling freight to Silver Creek." The girl's face fell, her last hope crumbling. Her eyes darted around frantically, from the empty expanse of the desert to the meager contents of the wagon bed. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Then her gaze fell on Jed's duster. It was large, thick, and hung off his frame like a curtain. It was a shadow she could disappear into. Her desperation gave her a final surge of courage. She moved to his side of the wagon, her small, dirty hand gripping his knee. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder. Jed flinched internally, but his expression remained unchanged. "Please, mister," she begged, her voice dropping to an urgent, conspiratorial whisper. "Let me hide, under your coat, just till they pass. They won't see me, please." It was an insane request, intimate and reckless. To shelter this girl was to claim her trouble as his own. It was to draw a line in the sand and dare those riders to cross it. It was everything he had come out here to avoid. He should have said no. He should have pried her hand from his leg and told Silas to drive on. He owed her nothing. He owed the world nothing anymore but his own absence. He looked down at her. Her face was tilted up to his. Her eyes a startling, clear blue beneath the grime, were pleading. They held a terror he recognized. He had seen it in the eyes of young recruits before a charge, in the eyes of men who knew their time was up. He had spent years trying to forget that look. His own cold, practical resolve began to crack. A deep, weary sigh, inaudible to anyone but himself, moved through him. He had tried to become as hard as the country he lived in, to build a fortress of indifference around the man he used to be. But the foundation of that fortress was crumbling. He did not ask her what she had done. He did not ask her who was chasing her, or why. In his experience, the reasons rarely mattered as much as the consequences, and the consequences were riding toward them on horseback. Asking for the story was an invitation, a form of entanglement. He wanted none of it, but to deny her refuge, that was another kind of action, another kind of choice, and in the stark, unforgiving light of the desert, it felt like the wrong one. Without a word, Jedediah Callahan made his decision. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a word of comfort. He simply shifted his weight, lifted the left side of his heavy duster, and held it open. It was an invitation into darkness, a small pocket of shadow in a world bleached by sunlight. It was a promise made not with words, but with dust and worn leather. He didn't promise to protect her. He didn't promise she'd be safe. He only offered concealment. He offered his presence as a shield. For a heartbeat, The girl, Clara, just stared. Then, understanding flooded her eyes, followed by a wave of raw, unutterable relief that almost buckled her knees. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled up onto the wagon's footboard, small and agile as a squirrel, and slipped into the space he had made for her. She pressed herself against his side, tucking her head down, making herself as small as possible. The duster fell, shrouding her completely. To anyone looking, it would seem only that the tall man on the wagon seat had shifted his position. Clara was enveloped in the scent of him-worn leather, trail dust, horse, and something else, something faintly metallic and smoky, like old gunpowder and wood smoke. He was warm, a solid wall of heat against her trembling body. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his breathing, the unyielding strength in his thigh and torso where she was pressed against him. She was hidden. For now, she was safe. Jed sat as still as stone, his arm holding the heavy fabric in place. He could feel her shaking, the small, terrified tremors that ran through her body. He was acutely, uncomfortably aware of her presence, the slight weight against his side, the warmth of her breath against his shirt. He kept his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. They were close enough now to be seen clearly. 3 hard-faced men on sturdy horses, rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They rode with an air of casual ownership, as if the entire desert belonged to them. Silas licked his dry lips, his eyes wide. "Jed, that looks like trouble." Jedediah Callahan didn't answer. He just watched the men approach, his face an unreadable mask. Under the heavy canvas of his coat, a frightened girl held her breath, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening. And Jed, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, had just become the only thing standing between her and them. The quiet he had been searching for had been shattered. The air grew thick with a tension that was almost as palpable as the heat. The 3 riders reined in their horses a few yards from the wagon, forming a loose, menacing semicircle. The animals stamped and snorted, their sweat-slicked hides gleaming in the sun, their presence blocking the only path forward. The man in the center, clearly the leader, was thin and wiry, with a narrow face and eyes that were too close together. He had the look of a weasel, sharp and predatory. He tipped his hat back with a thumb, a gesture that was meant to be casual but was laden with arrogance. The 2 men flanking him were of a different breed, thicker, duller, their expressions a mixture of slow-witted cruelty and obedience. They were the muscle, the hammers for the weasel's nail. "Mornin'," the leader said, his voice a dry rasp. It wasn't a greeting, it was a claim of territory. Unusual to see folks stopped out here in the middle of the day. Wagon trouble. Silas, beside Jed, practically vibrated with fear. No, sir, no trouble. Just giving the mules a breather. Hot day." He tried for a friendly smile, but it was a pathetic, trembling thing. The leader's eyes ignored Silas completely. They were fixed on Jedediah. He scanned him from his worn boots to the low brim of his hat. Taking his measure, he saw a big man, a quiet man. He likely mistook the stillness for simplicity, the silence for submission. It was a common mistake. "We're looking for someone," the man continued, his gaze sharp and probing. "A girl, young, blondish hair, blue eyes, dressed in a calico dress, probably torn to hell by now. Seen anyone like that?" Pressed against Jed's side, hidden in the suffocating darkness of the coat, Clara went rigid. A tiny, choked sound escaped her throat. Jed felt it more than heard it, a tremor of pure terror that shot through her body and into his. Her hand, which had been resting on his leg, clenched into a fist, the knuckles digging into his thigh. "Don't let them take me," she breathed, her whisper so faint it was little more than a current of warm air against his ribs. "Please, they'll kill me for what I know." Jed's own breath was steady. His posture hadn't changed by a fraction of an inch. but her words landed like stones in the still pool of his resolve. They'll kill me for what I know. It wasn't a simple crime she was running from. This was a matter of life and death, and she had just made him a party to it. He didn't ask what she knew. The knowing didn't matter. The conviction in her voice was enough. Can't say that we have, Jed said. His voice was low and flat, the sound of gravel rolling downhill. It was the first time he had spoken, and it seemed to suck the moisture from the air. The leader, Finch, narrowed his eyes. Jed's voice didn't match his appearance. It held a weight, a finality, that was unsettling. You sure about that? We tracked her this way. She's on foot. Couldn't have gotten far. This is a big country, Jed replied, his gaze unwavering. Easy to get lost. Finch leaned forward in his saddle, the leather creaking in protest. Maybe you ain't looking hard enough. Maybe we should have a look in your wagon. Sometimes people on the run like to hide under tarps and whatnot. This wagon is carrying freight for the Silver Creek Mercantile, Jed stated, his tone unchanged. It's sealed. It was a lie, but it was delivered with the cold authority of fact. Seals can be broken. It was at that moment that Jedediah Callahan's eyes changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was unmistakable to a man like Finch, whose survival depended on reading other men. The flat, winter sky blue of Jed's irises seemed to harden and sharpen, losing all trace of passivity. They became points of flint, cold and dangerous. The stillness in his body was no longer that of a weary traveler. It was the coiled, patient stillness of a rattlesnake before it strikes. The lines on his face, which had seemed like marks of simple hardship, now looked like warnings. Finch suddenly had the sickening feeling that he was not talking to a simple wagon guard. He was talking to someone who had stood on the edge of the abyss and had not flinched. I wouldn't advise it, Jed said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a quiet rumble of menace. The two brutes on either side of Finch shifted, their hands moving instinctively closer to their holstered pistols. Finch himself felt a prickle of sweat on his neck that had nothing to do with the sun. He had pushed, and he had hit something solid, something that might push back, hard. But he couldn't back down now. His authority depended on it. That sounds mighty like a threat. Jed didn't reply. The moment stretched, thin and taut. Silas looked like he might faint, under the coat. Clara held her breath until her lungs burned. This was it. The confrontation would happen here, a bloody, brutal fight under a merciless sun. But Jed had no intention of fighting them. Not here, not now. A gunfight was a fool's game of chance, and with Clara pressed against him, it wasn't a chance he was willing to take. His mind, honed by years of calculating odds and finding escape routes where none existed, had already moved 3 steps ahead. The mules, the wagon, the chaos. His left hand, hidden from view, shot out and slapped the rump of the mule closest to him with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. Simultaneously, he let out a sharp, guttural yell that was pure, primal command. The effect was instantaneous. The tired, half-asleep mules, startled by the sudden violence of the sound and the sting of the blow, surged forward as one. The heavy wagon lurched, wheels screaming, throwing Silas back against the seat with a yelp of surprise. The riders' horses, spooked by the sudden explosion of movement, shied and reared. Finch cursed, fighting to control his mount. The brief window of chaos was all Jed needed. Hold on, he growled, his arm wrapping around Clara's waist like a band of iron. He didn't give her time to think or react. In one fluid, powerful motion, he stood and launched himself off the side of the accelerating wagon, pulling her with him. They didn't jump so much as fall, a tangle of limbs and dusty canvas. Jed twisted in midair, ensuring his body would take the brunt of the impact. They hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The air was driven from Clara's lungs in a pained gasp. Jed's weight crushed her for a moment, but it also saved her from broken bones. They rolled once, twice, in the hot, gritty sand. coming to a stop in a heap of dust and confusion. Above them, shouts of anger and surprise cut through the air. The wagon was already 20 yards away, careening down the trail with a terrified Silas clinging to the reins, unable to control the panicked mules. Jed was on his feet in an instant, hauling Clara up with him. Her head was spinning, her body a collection of new aches. "Run!" he commanded, his voice sharp and urgent. He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed her hand, and they ran. They scrambled away from the road, heading into the broken, rocky terrain to the north. Their only hope was to get to ground where the horses couldn't easily follow. A gunshot cracked behind them, then another. A bullet whined past Jed's ear, unnervingly close. Another kicked up a spray of dirt at Clara's feet, and she cried out in terror. They didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury they couldn't afford. The sun was a physical weight, pressing down on them, stealing their breath. The ground was an oven, the heat rising through the thin soles of Clara's shoes. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt like lead, but Jed's grip was relentless. He was a machine, his long legs eating up the ground, his strength pulling her along when her own was failing. They stumbled through thorny mesquite, scrambled over sun-baked rocks that tore at their clothes and skin. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the rough terrain slowed the horsemen, but they were still there, a persistent, deadly threat on their heels. Clara's world shrank to the burning in her chest, the searing pain in her side, and the solid, unyielding grip of the stranger's hand in hers. He was her anchor in a sea of fire and fear. She ran on pure adrenaline, her mind a numb blur of terror. After what felt like an eternity, Jed slowed, pulling her behind a tall outcrop of red rock. He risked a look back. The riders were dismounting, arguing. They had lost the clear trail in the rocks. It had bought them time, but not safety. "We have to keep moving," he panted, his own breathing finally showing the strain. He looked at her, his face grim, streaked with sweat and dirt. "Can you make it?" She could only nod, unable to speak, her throat raw with dust. They moved again, slower now, a grueling, stumbling trek across the shimmering flats. The sun climbed higher, reaching its zenith, a white-hot eye in a bleached sky. There was no shade, no water, no relief, just an endless expanse of heat and rock and silence. Clara began to falter. Her vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges. Her legs refused to obey her. Just as she felt herself about to collapse, Jed stopped. "Look," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. She followed his gaze. In the distance, shimmering in the heat haze, was a dark shape, a small, square silhouette against the backdrop of the distant mountains. It was a building, a small cabin, alone and isolated. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. With Jed half carrying her, they covered the last stretch. It was an old ranger station, long abandoned. The wood was silvered and splintered by the sun and wind, the roof patched with the rusting tin, a window like a single, vacant eye. It was a ghost of a building, but to them, it was a fortress. Jed shoved open the groaning door, which protested on a single rusty hinge. The air inside was hot and stale, thick with the smell of dust and dry rot and forgotten things. But it was shelter. It was shadow. They stumbled inside, and Jed kicked the door shut behind them, plunging the small space into gloomy twilight. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own ragged, desperate breaths. Clara sagged against the wall, her legs finally giving out, and slid to the floor. Jed leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his eyes closed for a brief moment. They were safe. For now, outside, the sun continued its brutal assault on the land. Inside the derelict cabin, a man who sought only solitude and a girl who was running for her life sat in the shared, suffocating silence. The world shrunk to the four walls of their unlikely sanctuary. The silence that fell inside the cabin was a thick, heavy blanket, smothering the echoes of their panicked flight. For a long time, neither of them moved. Clara remained slumped against the wall, her body a single, throbbing ache, each breath a painful reminder of their desperate run. Jedediah stood with his back to the door, his large frame blocking the slivers of punishing sunlight that tried to pierce the gloom. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with his entire being, his senses cast out like a net into the vast, indifferent desert, searching for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. There was nothing, only the faint whisper of the wind as it moved through the cracked chinking in the log walls. Finally, Jed moved. He didn't speak to her, didn't even look at her. His actions were slow, deliberate, driven by a logic that transcended panic. He crossed the single room in 2 long strides and knelt by the cold, stone hearth. His large, calloused hands felt around the loose stones at its base until he found what he was looking for. He pried one free, revealing a dark cavity beneath. From it, he pulled a small, canvas-wrapped bundle. He unrolled it to reveal a tin of matches, a coil of fishing line, a small, sharp knife, and a strip of dried meat. Provisions from a previous life, or at least a previous visit. This was not a place he had stumbled upon by accident. He had been here before. The discovery sent a fresh wave of unease through Clara. This quiet, imposing stranger was not just a wagon guard. He was a man with hidden caches and secret refuges, a man who knew how to disappear. She was in his world now, a place far from any road or town, governed by rules she did not understand. She watched him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. He had saved her, yes, but he was still a mystery, and in her short, hard life, she had learned that mysteries were often just dangers she hadn't yet named. Jed broke off a piece of the jerky and tossed it to her. It landed softly in the dust near her hand. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a practical offering of sustenance, as one might feed a stray animal one had taken in. She stared at it for a moment before her hunger overwhelmed her suspicion. She picked it up, wiped it clean on her torn sleeve, and began to chew. It was tough as leather and salty as sin, but it was the most welcome food she had ever tasted. He moved to a dark corner of the cabin where a stack of old, rotting burlap sacks lay. He kicked them aside, revealing a wooden trapdoor with a rope handle. He heaved it open, exposing a dark, narrow shaft. A wave of cool, damp air rose from the depths. A cistern. He found a rusted bucket and a frayed rope nearby, remnants of the station's last occupant. After testing the rope's strength, he lowered the bucket into the blackness. The splash when it hit the water was a sound more beautiful than any music. He hauled it up, hand over hand, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his dusty shirt. The water was murky, with bits of debris floating on the surface, but it was water. He took a long drink directly from the bucket, then looked at her. Clara scrambled over, her thirst a desperate, clawing thing. She drank deeply, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. When she was finished, she looked up at him, her blue eyes shimmering with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. A silent thank you hung in the air between them, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. Words felt inadequate and potentially dangerous. That was how their first day passed, in a state of silent, exhausted recovery. They drank the murky water and finished the jerky. The sun arced across the sky, its light shifting through the cracks in the walls, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time. Clara's mind replayed the chase, the gunshots, the terror. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching men, but Jed seemed calm, his presence a steady, unmovable rock in the center of her fear. He sat on an overturned crate, cleaning his knife with a slow, methodical patience, his ears tuned to the world outside. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't ask her name, and for that, she was profoundly grateful. His silence gave her space to breathe, to simply exist without the need for explanation or justification. In a strange way, she felt safer in his quiet, intimidating company than she had ever felt in a crowded, noisy town. He asked nothing of her, and in her world, men always asked for something. As twilight bled across the desert, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a fragile truce settled between them. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind the deeper, more complicated reality of their situation. They were two strangers, fugitives from a shared threat, trapped in a forgotten shack in the middle of nowhere. The first night was the hardest. Sleep was a skittish creature, refusing to be caught. Clara huddled on the far side of the room, her arms wrapped around her knees, starting at every creak of the old building. Jed sat with his back against the door, a shadowy sentinel in the darkness. She didn't know if he slept at all. The sound of his steady, quiet breathing was a strange comfort, a human rhythm in the vast, empty silence of the desert night. The next morning, the routine of survival began, unspoken and intuitive. Jed rose with the first gray light of dawn. He took a piece of broken roof tin and began sharpening the edge of it on a flat stone. Then he went outside, moving with a quiet confidence that spoke of familiarity with the terrain. He returned an hour later with 2 rabbits, their necks broken cleanly. He skinned and gutted them with the same dispassionate efficiency he did everything else, his hands moving with a practiced economy. While he was gone, Clara knew she couldn't stay idle. To be useless was to be a burden, and burdens were often discarded. She swept the worst of the dust and debris from the cabin floor with a makeshift broom fashioned from a dry sagebrush branch. Then, tentatively, she ventured outside, never straying more than a stone's throw from the door. She gathered fallen branches and dry brush, her arms soon full of firewood. When Jed returned and saw the neat pile of kindling she had stacked by the hearth, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first sign of acknowledgement, of approval, that had passed between them. He said nothing, but the gesture spoke volumes. It said, "You are useful. You understand." He built a small, smokeless fire in the hearth, using a technique that was clearly not new to him. Soon, the smell of roasting meat filled the small cabin, a rich, savory scent that felt like a bulwark against the desolation outside. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the fire, the crackling flames a conversation in themselves. And so the days fell into a rhythm. A silent partnership was forged, not with words, but with deeds. Each morning, he would check the snares he had set or venture out to hunt. Each day, she would gather wood, haul water from the cistern, and search for edible plants she recognized from her childhood: wild onions, yucca roots. She found a patch of prickly pear and, using 2 sticks, carefully burned off the spines in the fire, offering the sweet, roasted fruit as her contribution to their meager larder. One afternoon, Jed climbed onto the dilapidated roof. A section of it was rotten, leaving a gaping hole to the sky. He found a few loose planks inside the cabin and, using the rusted nails he had painstakingly straightened, began to repair the damage. The steady, rhythmic sound of his hammering became the soundtrack to their lives, a constant, reassuring beat. It was the sound of a man building a defense, mending a shelter. It was the sound of permanence in a temporary world. He wasn't just fixing a roof. He was declaring their intention to stay, to survive. Clara watched him from below, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. She had spent her entire life in the company of men who took money, took advantage, took freedom. Jedediah took nothing. He simply did what needed to be done. He worked with a singular, focused purpose that seemed to leave no room for malice. His self-sufficiency was a wall around him, but it also felt like a shield for her. He needed nothing from her, and so she felt, for the first time, that she had nothing to fear from a man's desires. Her trust in him grew in small, incremental steps. It grew when he would return from a hunt and silently leave a canteen of fresh water for her, having found a hidden spring. It grew when a cold wind blew in one night, and she woke to find his heavy duster coat laid over her while she slept. He had given her his shadow on the wagon, and now he was giving her his warmth in the night. He never mentioned it, and neither did she, but the gesture settled deep inside her, a small, warm coal in the cold furnace of her fear. They never spoke of the past. His was a closed book, its pages filled with a history she could only guess at from the scars on his knuckles and the haunted distance in his eyes. Her own past was a fresh, open wound, and his silence was a mercy, a clean bandage that allowed it to begin to heal without the painful probing of questions. They were defined not by who they had been, but by what they were now, two people in a small room, bound by a shared enemy and the simple, desperate need to see the next sunrise. Their actions became a language more honest than any words. The roof he patched was his promise of shelter. The fire she tended was her promise of warmth. The food they shared was a pact of mutual survival. In the vast, lonely quiet of the New Mexico desert, they had found a way to speak without making a sound. Over a week had passed. The raw terror of the chase had receded, replaced by the quiet, demanding rhythm of survival. The abandoned station had become their world, a small island of habitable space in the vast, sun-scoured ocean of the desert. The patched roof no longer leaked when the rare afternoon shower passed over. A small fire was a near-constant presence in the hearth, a tame and welcome heart in the derelict cabin. A silent language had grown between them, built from shared tasks and respected boundaries. They existed in a state of close proximity and immense distance. They knew the sound of each other's breathing in the dark, the way the other moved across the creaking floorboards, but they remained strangers, each locked within the prison of their own history. The break in the silence came on a cool evening. The wind had picked up, a mournful sound that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the land with it. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Clara was mending a tear in her dress with a makeshift needle fashioned from a sharpened bone and a thread pulled from a burlap sack. Jed sat on his crate, oiling the action of an old pistol he carried holstered at the back of his belt, a weapon she had not seen him use but had always been aware of. Its presence was like his silence, a quiet but constant reminder of a dangerous world. He finished his task, the metallic click of the pistol's cylinder echoing in the small room. He then reached for a small tin he had filled with water and placed it in the coals of the fire. He had found a plant with a root that, when roasted and boiled, produced a bitter, smoky drink that vaguely resembled chicory coffee. He had made it every evening, a small ritual that marked the end of the day. When the water was hot, he poured it into 2 dented tin cups. He took one for himself and pushed the other across the dusty floor toward her. It was such a simple, ordinary gesture, but in the profound silence and isolation of their existence, it felt like a conversation. It was an act of care, however small, that went beyond the bare necessities of survival. It was this small, human act that finally unlatched the door to her past. She took the cup, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. She stared into the dark liquid for a long moment, the steam warming her face. "His name is Silas Thorne," she said. Her voice was quiet, rusty from disuse. The words seemed to hang in the air, foreign and loud in the silent room. Jed stopped with his own cup halfway to his lips. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening. His stillness had become attentive. "The man," she clarified, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "The one who sent those men, Finch. They all work for Thorne." She took a shaky breath, the dam of her silence finally broken. The story came out not in a flood, but in broken pieces, like she was pulling them from a deep, painful well. "My father, he was a good man, a good heart, but he had a weakness for cards. He owned a small ranch, east of here. It was all we had. He kept losing, to Thorne." She paused, taking a sip of the bitter drink. The warmth gave her courage. "Thorne owns the saloon in Dusty Creek. Owns the freight office, the general store. He owns most of the town. One way or another, he loans men money they can't pay back. And then he takes everything they have. He did it to my father. Took the cattle, then the land. There was nothing left but the debt. She looked up from her cup, her gaze finding his in the firelight. And me, my father, he made an arrangement, my hand in marriage, to clear the debt. He told me it was the only way, that Thorn was a powerful man, and he would take care of me. A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. Thorn's idea of taking care of a wife is the same way he takes care of a horse he owns. A roof, food, and the expectation of absolute obedience. He was not a kind man. His touch was like ice, and his eyes were always counting what he owned. I was just another asset on his ledger. She fell silent again, the memories casting a shadow over her face. Jed remained still, his expression unreadable. He did not press her, did not offer empty words of sympathy. He simply waited, giving her the space to finish. I knew I couldn't stay, she whispered. To stay would be a different kind of death, slower but just as final. The night before the ceremony, I decided to run, but I couldn't just leave. It wouldn't have been enough. He would have hunted me down for the insult, for his property escaping. I needed something to keep him at bay, something to make him afraid. Her hand went to a hidden pocket sewn into the inside of her dress. She pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package, her fingers trembling slightly, unwrapped it to reveal a small, leather-bound ledger, no bigger than a man's hand. The leather was worn, the pages filled with a tight, spidery script. He kept it in a locked drawer in his office, she said, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. His real books, not the ones he showed the tax man. This ledger is filled with every dirty deal, every bit of smuggled liquor, every man he cheated out of his land. It's all in here. Names, dates, amounts. It's the truth of how he built his little kingdom. I took it. I thought it would be my shield, my insurance, but I underestimated his ruthlessness. He doesn't want to bargain for it. He just wants it back, and he wants me silenced. Forever. She held the book out to him. It was a profound gesture of trust. She was handing him the physical manifestation of her past, the very thing that had put a price on her head. Her life's trouble, contained in 100 thin pages of ink and paper. For a long moment, Jed just looked at the book, then at her face. Illuminated by the fire, he saw the desperate hope and the lingering fear in her eyes. Slowly, he reached out and took the ledger. The leather felt cool and smooth in his rough, calloused hand. It felt heavier than it should. He opened it. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light, scanned the pages. He saw what she described: columns of figures, names of freighters, cryptic notes about shipments that never officially arrived, land deeds acquired for pennies on the dollar. It was the meticulous accounting of a predator. He turned a page, his thumb tracing a line of script, and then he froze. At the top of the page, written in a slightly more flamboyant hand, was a name: Silas Thorn. Jed's jaw tightened, a subtle ripple of muscle along his cheek. His whole body went still, but it was a new kind of stillness. It was the absolute calm that precedes a storm. He had run from the world of men and their petty evils, burying himself in the silence of the wilderness. And now, here it was, in his hand, in his cabin. The past had found him. I know the name, he said, his voice flat and cold. The name echoed in the recesses of his memory. Silas Thorn. Not a bounty, not a man he'd ever hunted. Worse, Thorn was a man who operated in the shadows, a purveyor of information, a snake who coiled around the law, never quite breaking it enough to hang, but poisoning everything he touched. Years ago, back when Jed still wore a badge, and later when he hunted men for money, Thorn had been a source, a man you could go to if you needed to know which way a fugitive was running, or where a man might fence stolen goods. Thorn sold information to both sides of the law, playing every angle, always ensuring he came out ahead. Jed had dealt with him once, maybe twice. He had walked away from those dealings feeling like he needed to wash his hands, feeling the grime of the man's corruption clinging to him. He remembered the cold, calculating eyes, the thin smile that never reached them. He remembered thinking that Thorne was the kind of man who would eventually build a throne on a pile of other men's bones. He had tried to forget that world. He had left it behind after a job went bad, after the lines between justice and vengeance had blurred into a bloody mess. He had traded his guns for the quiet life of a wanderer, a freight guard, a man who minded his own business. He had convinced himself that that part of him was dead and buried. But as he held the ledger, he felt the ghost of that man stir within him, the man who understood the crooked lines in Thorne's book, the man who knew how to read the map of a criminal's mind. He had thought he was done with it all, but the world had a long memory. A part of him, a cold, sharp, and purposeful part he had tried to suppress, was not done with the past. And the past, it was now clear, was not done with him. He closed the ledger with a soft snap. The sound was like a final verdict. He looked at Clara. Her face was pale, her eyes searching his, desperate for some sign of hope, some indication of what he would do. "He won't stop," she said, her voice trembling. "As long as I have this, he will never stop hunting me." Jed looked from her terrified face to the book in his hand. He had offered this girl a shadow to hide in, a roof to shelter under. He had done it out of a flicker of some buried instinct he thought he'd lost. But now, it was no longer that simple. This was not her trouble anymore. Silas Thorne had been a piece of grit in Jed's own past, a name associated with a life he had renounced. Now, Thorne had reached out from that past and laid a hand on the fragile piece Jed had tried to build. He didn't hand the ledger back to her. He kept it, his fingers wrapped tightly around the worn leather. The weight of it was his now. "Get some rest, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It was the first time he had used her name. He turned his gaze back to the fire, but he wasn't looking at the flames. He was looking at something far away, something only he could see. He was looking back down a long, dusty road he had sworn he would never travel again. The silence returned to the cabin, but it was a different silence now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a decision, and the cold, certain knowledge of a fight to come. The ledger changed everything. Before, the silence in the cabin had been one of cautious coexistence, a fragile peace built on the foundation of a shared, nameless threat. Now, the silence was different. It was charged, taut with the energy of a coming storm. The name Silas Thorne had been spoken, and it had summoned the ghosts of a life Jedediah had tried to outrun. The past was no longer a distant country. It was a physical presence in the room, sitting between them, its cold weight pressing down on the air. For 2 days after her confession, they barely spoke at all, but the quiet had a new texture. Jed was no longer just a survivor, mending a roof and setting snares. He had become a sentry. His movements were the same, but the purpose behind them had sharpened. When he cleaned his pistol now, it was not just a maintenance task, it was a preparation. When he stood at the cabin door, his gaze scanning the horizon, he was not merely watching for game, he was watching for death. The hunter in him, the soldier, the man who had lived by his wits and the speed of his draw, had reawakened. It was in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly tracked the smallest movement, a hawk circling, a dust devil spinning in the distance. He had been a man at rest. Now, he was a man at war. Clara felt the change viscerally. The sense of safety she had begun to build around herself, fragile as a spider's web, was being torn apart by this new, palpable tension. She found herself watching him, trying to read the grim lines of his face. He was still her protector, but the nature of that protection had transformed. Before, he had been a wall she could hide behind. Now, He was a weapon being honed for a battle she had brought to his door. The guilt was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. The third night after she showed him the ledger, a cold front blew in from the north. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper for days, rose to a low, keening howl. It rattled the newly patched roof and found every crack in the old log walls, filling the cabin with its mournful, restless voice. The temperature plummeted. It was a wind that carried the chill of high, lonely places, a wind that spoke of an ending season. Clara was asleep, huddled under Jed's duster coat, but the wind clawed its way into her dreams. She dreamt of running, the wind pushing her back, Finch's leering face appearing in the swirling dust ahead of her. She cried out, a small, choked sound, and jolted awake. Her heart was pounding, the dream's terror clinging to her like a shroud. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers, providing little light and even less warmth. The cabin was filled with the sound of the wind, a relentless, roaring symphony of desolation. She looked to the spot where Jed usually slept, his back to the door. He wasn't there. A spike of pure, cold fear, sharper than the wind's chill, shot through her. Had he left? Had he finally decided the trouble she carried was too heavy a burden and simply walked away, leaving her to her fate? She scrambled to her feet, her bare feet cold against the rough floorboards. The door was slightly ajar, held in place by a wooden wedge. A sliver of pale, ghostly moonlight cut across the floor. She crept toward it, her heart in her throat. She peered through the crack, and she saw him. He was standing on the small, dilapidated porch, a silhouette against the moon-drenched, wind-swept landscape. He was as still as the rock formations in the distance, a figure carved from darkness and resolve. The wind tore at his shirt, plastering it against the hard lines of his back and shoulders. But he seemed oblivious to the cold. In his right hand, held loosely but ready at his side, was his pistol. The moonlight glinted off the long, dark barrel. His head was turned to the south, his gaze fixed on the trail they had taken to get here. His entire posture was one of absolute, focused vigilance. This was not the calm, withdrawn man who had patched a roof and shared his meager food. The tranquility was gone, stripped away to reveal the hard, dangerous core of the man beneath. His eyes, she knew, would not be the color of a placid winter sky now. They would be sharp points of flint, missing nothing, prepared for anything. The sight stole her breath. He was standing guard. He was waiting for them. The raw, masculine power of his stance, the sheer, unyielding purpose radiating from him, was both terrifying and profoundly reassuring. He had not abandoned her. He was facing the danger head-on. She pushed the door open, the old wood groaning in protest against the force of the wind. The sound was loud in the night, but he didn't startle. He simply turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence. "You should be sleeping," he said, his voice low and rough, nearly carried away by the wind. She pulled the duster tighter around her shoulders, his scent of leather and dust a strange comfort. She stepped out onto the porch, the cold boards biting at her bare feet. The wind." "It's a tracker's wind," he said, his gaze returning to the southern horizon. "Covers your sound, but it kicks up dust. A smart man can read a trail from a mile away on a night like this." The implication hung in the cold air between them. He wasn't just guessing anymore. He knew. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling, though she already knew the answer. He was silent for a moment, listening to the voice of the wind as if it were an old friend telling him secrets. A man like Thorne doesn't give up, not over a property dispute, and damn sure not over a book that could put a rope around his neck. He's not a rancher. He's a spider. You've torn a hole in his web, and he won't rest until he's stitched it up with your own thread. He finally turned to look at her, his face half in shadow, half in moonlight. His expression was grim, devoid of any illusion. That driver, Silas, they would have found him. Men like Silas talk. They talk when they're scared. And Finch is good at scaring men. He'll have told them which way the wagon was headed. Where we jumped, Thorne will have hired the best trackers gold can buy. They've been sweeping the territory, section by section. They'll know about this old station. It's on the old maps, a place a man on the run might hole up. He paused, letting the cold reality of his words sink in. They're not just searching anymore. They're closing in. They'll be here, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, but they'll be here. The certainty in his voice was absolute. It was not a fear. It was a fact, a cold, hard calculation made by a man who understood the grim arithmetic of pursuit and evasion. The weight of it all crushed down on Clara. All this time, she had held on to a sliver of hope that they had escaped, that Thorne's men would lose the trail and give up. Now she saw that hope for what it was, a child's fantasy, and Jedediah had known it all along. He had been preparing for this moment from the second he took that ledger from her hand. She looked at his resolute profile, at the gun held so steadily in his hand, and the guilt she felt became an unbearable weight. He was going to fight. He was going to stand his ground and face down armed men, a fight that had nothing to do with him, all because of a choice she had made. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't your fight. You can leave. Go, before they get here. I brought this on you. You don't have to risk your life for me." She meant it. In that moment, she would have faced Finch and his men alone if it meant this stranger, who had shown her more decency in a week than she'd known in a year, could walk away unharmed. Jedediah turned his head and looked at her fully. The moonlight carved his face into stark plains and deep shadows. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools, but she saw a flicker of something in their depths, something ancient and weary. "I'm not doing this for you, Clara." The words were quiet, but they hit her with the force of a physical blow. They were cold, direct, and devastating. She felt her chest tighten, a sharp pang of rejection and confusion. He must have seen the hurt in her eyes, because his expression softened by a fraction. He took a step closer, the wind whipping a loose strand of her hair across her face. "I mean," he clarified, his voice still low but losing its hard edge, "it's not just for you." He looked out into the howling darkness, at the vast, empty land that had been his refuge. "I've spent the last 5 years turning my back. I saw a man beating his horse, and I turned my back. I saw a landowner cheating a family out of their water rights, and I turned my back. I saw good men pushed into bad situations and bad men get away with murder, and I kept walking. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself I was done with the world and its troubles." He looked down at the gun in his hand, turning it over as if seeing it for the first time. A man can only turn his back so many times before he forgets who he is, before he becomes nothing more than a ghost, a shadow drifting through the world. "I ran from men like Thorne. I ran from the violence, from the choices. I came out here seeking quiet." He lifted his gaze and met hers. His eyes were clear now, filled with a raw, painful honesty. "But there's a difference between quiet and emptiness." "This," he said, his voice a low, powerful rumble that seemed to push back against the wind. "This is a fight I know. I know this man. I know his kind. And I'm not doing this because you brought it to my door. I'm doing it because I'm done running from it. I'm doing it because I don't want to turn my back anymore." The confession wrested from the deepest parts of his solitary soul, hung between them, more real and more powerful than the howling wind. It was not a declaration of affection, not a promise of heroism. It was something far more profound. It was the reclamation of a man's own soul. He wasn't saving her from her past. He was saving himself from his future, a future of endless, empty wandering. Clara stared at him, her fear and guilt washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of understanding. He wasn't trapped. He was making a choice. She hadn't been a burden. She had been a catalyst. She had stumbled into his life and handed him a reason to stop running. a reason to finally stand his ground and be the man he had tried so hard to bury. In the cold, desolate heart of the desert night, with the wind screaming around them, two fugitives stood on a crumbling porch, no longer just a man and a woman hiding from danger, but two people bound together by a single, defiant purpose. The fight was coming, and they would face it together. The world was reborn in a whisper of pale gray light. Dawn in the desert was a fragile, holy thing. A moment of false peace before the sun began its daily assault. Inside the cabin, there was no peace. Jedediah had been awake for hours, a motionless shadow by the cabin's single, shuttered window, a rifle resting across his knees. He had not needed the wind to tell him they were coming. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, a low hum of impending violence that was as familiar to him as his own pulse. Clara was awake too, lying on her pallet of burlap sacks, the duster coat a poor defense against the chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was the cold stone of dread in the pit of her stomach. She watched Jed's silhouette, the absolute stillness of him. He was a mountain, immovable and silent, waiting for the earthquake he knew was on its way. And then it came, not as a crash of thunder, but as a faint, rhythmic drumming that grew from the silence. It was the sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, steady and unhurried, the sound of predators who knew they had their prey cornered. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Jed didn't move, but she saw his head tilt, his entire body a listening instrument. He pushed himself slowly to his feet and moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. The drumming grew louder, closer. It was not one horse. It was three. He looked back at her, his face grim in the half-light. There were no words of reassurance. He simply gave a sharp, downward jerk of his head. Get down. She scrambled to the floor behind an old, overturned table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Jed moved to the window, nudging the shutter open a fraction of an inch, through the sliver of a gap. The scene outside was stark and clear. Three riders, dark against the brightening eastern sky, had reined in their horses about 100 yards from the cabin. It was Finch, flanked by the same two brutish men from the trail. They fanned out, their movements practiced and tactical, forming a loose arc of attack. They were not here to talk. Jedediah Callahan. Finch's voice cut through the morning air, thin and sharp. I should have known a man like you would take up with trash. Throw the girl out, and the book she stole, and we might just let you walk away from this. Jed didn't answer. He was a statue, his eye pressed to the crack in the shutter. He was calculating angles, judging distances, reading the posture of the men. They were confident, arrogant. They thought they had a single, cornered man. Last chance. Callahan, Finch yelled, his patience wearing thin. One of the men on his right unslung his rifle, resting it on his saddle horn. In that instant, the world exploded. Jed shoved the shutter open, the old wood groaning in protest. He brought his rifle to his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. The shot was not aimed at Finch. It was aimed at the horse belonging to the man on the left. The boom of the rifle echoed off the distant mesas, a deafening roar that shattered the morning's peace. The horse screamed, a terrible high-pitched sound, and crumpled to the ground. Its front legs shattered. The rider was thrown clear, landing hard in the dust with a curse. The move was pure, brutal strategy. It created chaos, broke their formation, and took one man out of the immediate fight. A second later, a bullet splintered the wood of the window frame, inches from Jed's head. He had already dropped back, moving away from the opening. "Stay down!" he yelled to Clara, his voice a harsh command. The air was suddenly filled with the roar of gunfire. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the cabin, punching holes in the rotting logs, sending splinters flying. It was like being inside a drum being beaten by a madman. Clara pressed herself flat, her face in the dust, her arms covering her head. This was it, the end of her running. Jed moved with a terrifying calm amidst the chaos. He was no longer the quiet stranger. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of deadly, efficient motion. He fired through the window again. A quick, aimed shot. The man whose horse he'd shot had been scrambling for cover behind a rock. He never made it. He simply jerked and lay still. One down. Finch and the remaining men were now dismounted, using their dead horses for cover, returning fire. Jed moved to the far side of the cabin, kicking a loose log from the chinking to create a new firing port. He was thinking, adapting, always one step ahead. He fired once, twice. The third man cried out, a sharp yell of pain, and his rifle clattered to the ground. He clutched his arm, blood blooming dark on his sleeve. Jed had wounded him, not killed him. A wounded man was a liability, but the exchange had cost him. As he pulled back from the opening, Finch, who had been waiting for just such a moment, fired. Clara heard a heavy, wet thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath from Jed. She looked up. He was leaning against the wall, his face pale, his jaw clenched. A dark, ugly stain was spreading rapidly across his left shoulder and down his arm. "Jed!" she cried, her voice thin with terror. "I'm fine," he gritted out, the words a lie. He tried to raise the rifle again, but his left arm was useless, hanging limp at his side. The pain must have been blinding. He was forced to brace the heavy gun against the wall. His movement slowed, his aim compromised. The fight had shifted. Finch knew it. The barrage of bullets against the cabin stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man outside and the low whistle of the wind. Jed motioned for Clara to stay put, his eyes fixed on the door. He knew Finch would make a move. He just didn't know from where. The attack came from the window. With a sudden, violent crash, Finch smashed through the shuttered frame, a blur of motion and dust. He was smaller than Jed, wiry and quick like a snake. He didn't go for Jed, who was struggling to bring the long rifle to bear with one arm. He went for the easier target. He lunged for Clara. Before she could even scream, he was on her, dragging her up from behind the table. One rough hand tangled in her hair, yanking her head back. The other arm wrapped around her throat, and she felt the cold, hard steel of a pistol barrel press against her temple. Her world shrank to that single point of cold pressure. Her breath seized in her lungs. "Drop it! Callahan!" Finch snarled, his breath hot and foul against her ear. "Drop the rifle, or the girl's brains get splattered all over this filthy floor." Jed froze. His face was a mask of agony and fury. He looked at Clara, at the gun pressed to her head, and a look of pure, animal helplessness passed through his eyes. Slowly, painfully, he let the rifle slide from his grip and clatter to the floor. He stood there, swaying slightly, his wounded arm dripping blood onto the dusty planks. "Now the book," Finch demanded, dragging Clara toward the center of the room, using her body as a shield. "Give me the book." Jed's gaze flickered to Clara's dress, to the hidden pocket. Finch saw the look and laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound. "Smart girl, keeping it close. Get it." His grip on her throat tightened, the gun pressing harder against her skull. Trembling, her mind a numb fog of terror, Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, oilskin-wrapped ledger. She held it out. "Toss it over here," Finch commanded Jed, slowly. As Jed bent down to pick it up, Clara's eyes, wide with fear, darted around the room. They fell upon the hearth and upon what was hanging above it. It was an old, long-barreled hunting rifle, a relic left by the last ranger, held in place by 2 iron hooks. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, ancient and forgotten. It was probably empty, probably broken, but it was a chance. In that split second, as Finch's attention was focused on Jed and the ledger, something inside Clara snapped. The terror that had paralyzed her for so long suddenly burned away. replaced by a white-hot surge of pure, defiant rage. She thought of Jed, bleeding on the floor for her. She thought of a life spent cowering, running, and being treated as property. And she decided, in that instant, that it was over. She didn't scream, she didn't think, she acted. She stomped down, hard, with the heel of her boot onto Finch's instep. He roared in pain and surprise, his grip on her loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She ducked under his arm, tearing herself free, and scrambled toward the fireplace. Finch cursed, raising his pistol to fire at her. But Jed used that same instant. He launched himself forward, not as a fighter, but as a battering ram, slamming his good shoulder into Finch's midsection. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. Clara reached the hearth. She leaped onto a stone ledge, her trembling hands grabbing the heavy rifle. It was far heavier than she had imagined, awkward and cold. She pulled it from its hooks and stumbled back to the floor, turning, trying to bring the long barrel around. Jed and Finch were grappling on the floor. Finch was strong, wiry, and desperate. He brought the butt of his pistol up, cracking it against Jed's temple. Jed grunted, his head snapping back, his movements becoming sluggish from pain and blood loss. Finch was winning. He was pushing Jed onto his back, bringing the pistol around to end it. "No!" The word was torn from Clara's throat, a raw, ragged sound. She lifted the rifle, her arms shook violently, the barrel waving in wild arcs. She had never fired a gun in her life. She closed her eyes, aimed in Finch's direction, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. The rifle kicked back with the force of a mule, slamming into her shoulder and sending her staggering backward. The room filled with a thick cloud of acrid black powder smoke. When she opened her eyes, her ears ringing, Finch was on his knees, staring at his own shoulder in disbelief. A dark, ragged hole had appeared in his coat, from which blood was already pouring. He looked up at her, his face a mask of shock and fury. Her shot, wild and panicked, had found its mark. The distraction was all Jed needed. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he lunged forward, grabbing Finch's gun hand and slamming it against the floor until the pistol skittered away. Then, his face a grim mask of finality, he rose to his knees and finished the fight. It was brutal, quick, and silent. A profound, ringing silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the sound of Jed's ragged breathing. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. Outside, the wounded man had stopped whimpering. Jed pushed himself away from Finch's still form and collapsed against the wall, his head lolling back, his eyes closing. He had reached the absolute limit of his endurance. Clara stood in the middle of the room, the heavy hunting rifle still clutched in her hands. Her arms ached, her shoulder was a blaze of fire, and her ears rang. She looked at the carnage, at the still forms of the men who had hunted her. She looked at Jed, bleeding and unconscious against the wall, and she looked down at the weapon in her hands, the tool of her own violent salvation. The terror was gone. The instinct to run, to hide, to cower, it had all been burned out of her in that single, deafening blast. In its place was a strange, cold calm. For the first time in her life, she was not afraid. The ringing in Clara's ears slowly subsided, replaced by a silence so profound it was a physical weight. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, was now a tomb, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid sting of gunpowder. For a long, paralyzed moment, she stood frozen, the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands, its dead weight the only real thing in a world that had tilted off its axis. Then, a low groan from the far wall broke the spell. "Jed!" The rifle clattered to the floor. She flew to his side, her own aches and the violent tremor in her limbs forgotten. He was slumped against the logs, his head lolling, his face a waxy, unnatural pale beneath the grime and blood. His breathing was shallow, a faint, ragged flutter in his chest. The dark stain on his shoulder had spread, soaking his shirt and dripping in a slow, viscous trickle onto the floorboards. He was unconscious, but he was alive. That single fact became the new center of her universe. The fear, the rage, the strange, cold calm, it all coalesced into a single, ferocious purpose: he would not die. Her hands, which had been shaking so violently she could barely hold the rifle, became steady. Her mind, a moment before a chaotic storm, became ruthlessly clear. She remembered things she didn't know she knew, lessons gleaned from a hard life on the frontier where self-sufficiency was not a virtue, but a necessity. First, the bleeding. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her already tattered dress. It wasn't clean, but it was all she had, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She tore open his shirt, exposing the wound. It was a nasty, ragged hole, the bullet having torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder. She pressed the makeshift bandage against it. Hard, her whole body leaning into the effort. She held it there, her knuckles white, until the steady seep of blood began to slow. She tore another strip and bound it tightly, her knots clumsy but firm. Next, the others. She couldn't leave them here. She couldn't let him wake up to this. The thought of it was a violation, a desecration of the fragile safety he had given her. The task was gruesome, monumental, but her resolve was absolute. She went to the man Jed had shot first, the one by the window. She avoided looking at his face. She grabbed him by the ankles and pulled. He was a dead weight, heavy and uncooperative. She strained, her muscles screaming, her back threatening to give way, inch by agonizing inch. She dragged him across the floor and out the door, leaving a dark smear on the dusty planks. She did the same with Finch, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She left them in the harsh light of the morning sun, a grim offering to the indifferent desert. The third man, the one he had wounded in the arm, was gone. He had fled. The effort left her gasping, drenched in sweat, her body trembling with exhaustion. But the cabin was clear. It was hers and Jed's now. She collapsed beside him, her energy spent. He hadn't moved. His skin was hot to the touch, a dry, burning heat that spoke of a coming fever. He needed water. She stumbled to the corner, lowered the bucket into the cistern, and hauled it up, her raw hands protesting. She brought the water to his lips, tipping the bucket to let a small trickle run into his mouth. He swallowed weakly, a purely reflexive action. That was how the first day passed, in a blur of fear and desperate, rudimentary nursing. She cleaned the blood from the floor. She found his small canvas bundle and used his knife to cut away the blood-soaked fabric around the wound. She cleaned it as best she could with the water she boiled over the fire, her hands gentle, her movements focused. He never stirred, lost in a darkness she couldn't reach. The second day, the fever took hold. It was a vicious, consuming fire. His skin burned, and yet he shivered, his body racked with violent tremors. His quiet stillness was gone, replaced by a restless tossing. He was no longer in the cabin in 1873. He was somewhere else, somewhere deep in his past, trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake. He began to talk, not words, at first, but low, guttural moans, fragments of sentences that made no sense. His voice was a raw, broken thing, filled with a pain that was older and deeper than any bullet wound. Clara sat beside him, wiping his brow with a cool, damp rag. Listening, she became the keeper of his ghosts. "River," he would rasp, his head thrashing from side to side. "Too fast. Hold on. Just hold on." She would lean in close, her own voice a desperate whisper. "I'm here. Jed, I'm holding on." He wouldn't hear her. He was lost. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the sun's passage across the sky, visible through the bullet holes in the walls. Her world shrank to the small, sweltering cabin and the man burning up within it. She checked the snares he had set. Finding a rabbit in one, she cooked it, making a thin, watery broth that she patiently spooned between his cracked lips. Most of it dribbled out, but she kept trying. She hauled water. She kept the fire low. She sat watch. She did not sleep. On the third night, the fever reached its peak. He was a furnace, his body rigid, and in the depths of his delirium, he spoke a name. Elena. The name was a wound in itself, spoken with a voice of such profound, gut-wrenching loss that it made Clara's own heart ache. Elena, my hand, take my hand. God, no, he cried out, a terrible tearing sound of pure agony. His hand, which had been clenched into a fist, shot out, his fingers grasping at the empty air, searching for someone who wasn't there. Without thinking, Clara took his hand. It was huge, calloused, and burned like a coal from the fire. His fingers closed around hers with a desperate, crushing strength. He was holding on to her as if she were the only thing keeping him from being swept away. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She was no longer just his nurse. She was his anchor. She was the hand he was reaching for in the dark. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, the hot, dry skin smelling of dust and sickness. You can't die, she whispered, her voice fierce, a command born of sheer desperation. Do you hear me, Jedediah? You are not allowed to die. I'm still here. She repeated it over and over, a litany, a prayer against the encroaching darkness. I'm still here. I'm still here. His grip on her hand was her only answer. She sat like that through the long, dark hours of the night, holding his hand, her voice a constant, whispered presence in the storm of his fevered mind. Sometime before dawn, the crisis passed. The violent shivering subsided, replaced by a deep, drenching sweat. The fire within him was burning out. His breathing, which had been harsh and ragged, deepened and became more even. His grip on her hand loosened, his fingers going slack. For the first time in days, he was at rest. She watched him, her body numb with exhaustion, her heart a fragile, fluttering thing. She didn't dare to hope. She simply watched and waited. 2 more days passed in this new, quiet state. He slept, a deep, healing sleep. She kept tending to him, cleaning the wound, giving him water, sleeping in short, fitful bursts in a chair she had propped near his side. She never let go of his hand. It was on the 5th night after the fight that he woke. The cabin was lit by a single, flickering candle she had found in his supplies. The world outside was utterly silent. She had been dozing, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand still holding his. A faint movement made her stir. She lifted her head, her neck stiff with cramp. His eyes were open, not wide, just cracked slits, the blue no longer glassy with fever, but clear and lucid. Reflecting the candlelight, they were focused on her. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He swallowed, a painful, difficult motion. He tried again. His voice was a dry, rasping whisper, barely audible. You didn't leave. The question was so simple, so unexpected. It wasn't about the fight, or his wound, or the men who were now buried under a pile of rocks 100 yards from the cabin. It was about her. He had woken from the depths of his own private hell, and his first thought was of her. His first thought was that she would be gone. He had expected to wake up alone. The simple, heartbreaking question shattered the last of her defenses. All the terror, the exhaustion, the grief, and the fierce, protective tenderness of the past week crested within her. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. Soon. She was crying, not with loud, racking sobs, but with a silent, profound weeping that shook her entire body. He watched her, his expression a mixture of confusion and a dawning, fragile wonder. His thumb moved, a faint, weak stroke against the back of her hand. She finally found her voice, though it was thick and choked with tears. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, I've been running my whole life, from my father's debts, from Thorn, from everything. I'm done running." She looked at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his steady gaze in the candlelight. She squeezed his hand, her promise a sacred vow in the quiet of the night. "I'm staying," her words. "I'm staying," were a quiet stone dropped into the deep well of their shared silence, the ripples spreading out to change the shape of everything that followed. In the days after Jed's fever broke, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It was no longer the tense, watchful silence of fugitives, nor the heavy, grief-stricken silence of the fevered dreams. It was a domestic quiet, a silence of purpose and shared space. Clara had packed her fear away. She bundled it up with the memories of Finch's cruel grasp and the roar of the hunting rifle, and she buried it deep inside herself. There would be time for it later, perhaps. Or perhaps, like the bodies buried under the rocks, it was a part of the past that was best left undisturbed. Now, there was work to be done. There was a life to be reclaimed. Not the one she had lost, but a new one to be built from the ashes of the old. The cabin, which had been a desperate refuge, became a home under her determined hands. She swept the floor not just of dust, but of the lingering ghosts of violence. She found a bucket of old lime wash in a corner of the lean-to, and with a rag, she scrubbed the log walls, brightening the gloomy interior until the sunlight that streamed through the bullet holes seemed less like wounds and more like windows. She took Jed's knife and scraped away the soot and grime from the stones of the hearth, revealing the warm, earthy colors beneath. The place began to breathe again. Her focus was absolute. She cooked with a fierce creativity, turning the meager fruits of Jed's snares and her own foraging into savory stews. The smell of roasting rabbit and wild onions replaced the scent of blood and gunpowder. She found that the simple, repetitive tasks of survival were a balm to her frayed soul. Kneading dough for flatbread, mending the tears in Jed's shirts with a bone needle, tending the small fire, each action was a stitch, mending not just fabric, but the torn edges of her own spirit. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. Jed watched her. In the beginning, he was too weak to do much else. He would lie on his cot, his wounded shoulder bound tightly, and follow her movements as she bustled about the small room. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to a world that was as empty and silent as he was. Her presence was a profound and startling intrusion. She filled the space not with chatter, but with life, with the soft sounds of purpose, the scrape of a spoon in an iron pot, the rustle of her dress as she moved, the quiet hum of a song she sometimes sang under her breath when she thought he was asleep. He never spoke of it. Words were a foreign country to him, a place he had not visited in years. But his gratitude, his dawning wonder at this woman who had not only saved his life but was now rebuilding it alongside her own, manifested in 100 small, unspoken ways. As he began to heal, he found his own language. One evening, Clara worked late, grinding dried roots for their morning's chicory drink, until she fell asleep where she sat, her head slumped on the rough-hewn table. She woke hours later, in the cold, pre-dawn light, to find herself not at the table but on her own pallet, Jed's heavy duster coat tucked carefully around her. He was sitting in his usual spot by the door, a silent guardian in the darkness. He had carried her, a feat that must have sent fire through his wounded shoulder, and she had not even stirred. Another time, after a long day of hauling water from the cistern, a task that left her hands raw and her back aching, she returned to the cabin to find a tin cup of cool water waiting for her on the porch step. He had said nothing, simply anticipated her need and met it. It was a gesture of such simple, profound care that it brought tears to her eyes. He was a man who spoke in deeds, not words, and his actions were a form of poetry she was beginning to understand. His strength returned slowly. Soon he was able to walk outside, to sit on the porch and feel the sun on his face. He would watch her as she worked, and she would feel his gaze on her, not as an intrusion, but as a quiet, steady presence. One morning, he took a piece of scrap wood and his knife and began to carve. He worked for hours, his hands slow but sure. When he was done, he had fashioned a new handle for the cistern bucket, smooth and perfectly fitted to her hand, replacing the old, frayed rope that had cut into her palms. He simply left it by the trap door for her to find. There was no presentation, no expectation of thanks. The gift was the act itself. This was how they communicated, in a silent, intricate dance of care and provision. She would mend his clothes, and he would sharpen her knife. She would cook his meal, and he would ensure the wood pile was always high. They were two solitary people learning to orbit one another, their gravity a quiet, inexorable pull of shared experience and mutual respect. One morning, Clara ventured further from the cabin than she ever had before. She walked to a small, sheltered arroyo, where a trickle of hidden water gave life to a patch of stubborn desert wildflowers. They were small, delicate blossoms of a startling, defiant blue, a splash of impossible color against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. She picked a single sprig, its petals fragile and perfect. She returned to the cabin and, without a word, placed the sprig of wildflowers on the porch step, right where he would see it when he came out. It was a foolish, hopeful gesture. It was an offering of beauty in a world that had shown them only ugliness. It was a whisper of a future that might hold more than just survival. She felt a blush of self-consciousness as she did it, but she left it there and went inside, her heart beating a little faster. Jed came out a few minutes later. She watched him through a crack in the door. He stopped, his gaze falling on the small blue flower. He stood there for a long time, so still he might have been carved from the same rock as the mesas. She couldn't see his face, couldn't read his reaction. Then, he bent down, his movement stiff from his injury, and picked it up. He held it in his large, scarred palm, looking at it as if it were a rare and precious jewel. Then he turned and went back inside, the flower still in his hand. He didn't mention it. The day passed as all the others had, filled with the quiet rhythm of their shared tasks. Clara felt a small pang of disappointment. Perhaps he had thought it was silly. Perhaps it meant nothing to him. That evening, as the last of the light faded from the sky, she saw him sitting at the table, a small, leather-bound book open before him. It was not Thorne's ledger. It was a different book, one she had seen him take from his saddlebags. It was his own. A journal, perhaps, though she had never seen him write in it. The pages she had glimpsed were mostly blank. The candlelight flickered across his face, illuminating the deep concentration in his eyes. He had the small blue wildflower, with infinite care. He opened the book to a clean, empty page in the middle. He gently laid the flower flat against the paper. Then he closed the book, pressing down on it for a long moment, as if to impress the memory of the small, beautiful thing into the empty pages of his own story. He had not discarded her offering. He had not merely accepted it. He had preserved it. He had taken her small act of hope and placed it in the heart of his own solitude, a single spot of color in the blankness of his future. It was a promise, made without a single word. It was an acceptance. She turned away from the door, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. They had never spoken of love. They had never spoken of tomorrow. They had never made a single promise to one another. But in the quiet language of their shared world, every action was a vow. The mended shirt, the cup of water, the carved handle, the pressed flower, they were all promises. They were the silent, sturdy bricks with which two broken people were, word by wordless word, building a home. The seasons began to turn. The brutal, white-hot glare of summer softened. The mornings grew crisp, and the angle of the sun shifted, casting longer shadows across the land. Weeks bled into a month. Then, too, the raw, violent memories of the shootout faded, becoming a part of the cabin's history, like the silvered wood of its walls or the rusted nails in its roof. Life settled into a rhythm that was as steady and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Jed's shoulder healed, leaving behind a puckered, angry scar that he never spoke of. His strength returned fully, and with it, his tireless energy for work. He was a man who seemed most at peace when his hands were busy. He reinforced the walls of the cabin, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and dried grass until it was impervious to the wind. He built a sturdy new door with a wooden latch. He fashioned a rough-hewn table and 2 stools from the wood of a long-dead cottonwood tree. Each new addition was a silent declaration of permanence, another root put down into the hard, unforgiving soil. Clara, in turn, had transformed the interior from a shelter into a home. She had found wild gourds and hollowed them out for bowls. She had woven floor mats from river reeds. The cabin was still spare and rustic, but it was clean, orderly, and filled with the quiet warmth of their shared existence. They were a self-contained world, a universe of 2. They still spoke very little, but they no longer needed to. They moved around each other with an easy, practiced grace, their separate tasks weaving together to form the single, strong thread of their life. She knew by the set of his shoulders when his wound was paining him. He knew by the slight tremor in her hands when the memories of the past were visiting her. Their isolation was absolute. The world beyond the surrounding mesas might as well not have existed. Then, one hot afternoon, the world came to them. It was Jed who saw him first. He was on the roof, securing the last of the new shingles he had painstakingly split. When his body went rigid, Clara, who was scrubbing laundry in a wooden bucket below, saw the change in him, and her heart leaped into her throat. She followed his gaze. A figure was approaching from the south, a single rider on a mule, moving at a slow, plodding pace. Instinct, born of a terror she thought she had buried, took over. She scrambled inside, her hand reaching for the old hunting rifle above the hearth. Jed was down from the roof in a flash, his own pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. He stood just inside the door, a dark, menacing silhouette, waiting. The rider was not a threat. As he drew closer, they could see he was an old man, thin as a rail, with a long white beard and a battered hat. He was a prospector, or perhaps a circuit preacher, one of the lonely, wandering souls who drifted through the territory's most forgotten corners. His mule was laden with picks, pans, and a bedroll. He looked as weary and weathered as the landscape itself. He reined in his mule a respectful distance from the cabin, holding up an empty hand in a universal sign of peace. "Howdy, folks," he called out, his voice a friendly, reedy crackle. "Name's Alistair, just passing through. Saw your smoke. Hoping I might trade some news for a cup of fresh water." Jed didn't lower his gun, but the tension in his stance eased slightly. "Water's in the cistern. What kind of news?" The old man dismounted, his joints creaking. "News from all over, but I just come from Dusty Creek. That town's in a whole heap of trouble." He looked at Clara, who had emerged from the cabin to stand hesitantly behind Jed. "You folks from around there?" Clara shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. "Well, it's a mess," Alistair went on, happy to have an audience. "The whole town was run by a fella named Silas Thorne, a real snake in the grass, from what I hear. Turns out, he was into every dirty deal from here to Santa Fe. Smuggling, land fraud, you name it. Word is, some federal marshals got a tip, came in quiet-like and started digging. Found his real account books. The whole house of cards came tumbling down." Clara felt the world tilt. She put a hand on the doorframe to steady herself. Jed's shoulders were a rigid wall in front of her, but she knew he was listening to every word. "They arrested him a few weeks back," the old man continued, warming to his story. "Him and that hired gun of his, a nasty piece of work named Finch. They say Thorne tried to claim a young woman he was set to marry had stolen the books and run off, but nobody believed him. The marshals are taking him back east for trial. He won't ever see the light of day again, I reckon. Dusty Creek is free of him." The words hung in the hot, still air, free of him. Clara's mind reeled. The threat that had shaped her entire existence for months. The reason she had run. The reason she had met Jed. The reason she was standing here in this forgotten corner of the world. It was gone. The ledger, which she had kept wrapped in its oilskin pouch and hidden beneath a loose floorboard, was no longer a death warrant. It was just a book. Silas Thorne was a caged animal. His power broken, his reach cut short. She was free. The thought was so vast, so overwhelming. It was terrifying. She could leave. She could walk away from this cabin, this life, this man. She could go to California, to Oregon, to any one of the 1,000 places she had dreamed of while trapped in Dusty Creek. She could get a job, make a new name for herself, a life of her own choosing, without fear, without looking over her shoulder. The door to the world, which had been slammed shut in her face, had just been thrown wide open. Alistair drank his water, shared a bit of their stew, and, his supply of news exhausted, finally mounted his mule and continued on his solitary journey, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from which he had emerged. He left behind a silence that was heavier and more charged than any that had come before. The unspoken question was a living thing in the small cabin. What now? Jed didn't ask it. He didn't look at her. After the old man was gone, he picked up an axe and went to the small, makeshift corral he had built, where he began splitting wood for a new fence post. He worked with a fierce, focused energy, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the vast quiet. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching him. The sun beat down on his back, soaking his shirt with sweat until it clung to the hard muscles of his shoulders and spine. Each swing of the axe was powerful, efficient, a testament to his renewed strength. He was a part of this place now. His sweat and his blood were in its soil. His labor was in its walls. He was rooted here in a way she had never seen a man be rooted anywhere. She looked from him to the endless horizon. Out there was freedom. Out there was the unknown, 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 different lives she could lead. It was everything she had ever wanted. But as she stood there, the image of that abstract freedom began to feel thin and pale compared to the solid, tangible reality of the man in front of her. What would that freedom look like? A lonely room in a crowded city, a string of faceless employers, a life spent trying to forget the feel of a man's hand in hers during a fevered night. The quiet satisfaction of seeing him eat a meal she had cooked. The way he had pressed a single wildflower into the empty pages of his book. She had spent her entire life running. She had run from a future she didn't want, and now she was being offered the chance to run toward a future she couldn't even imagine. But running was what you did when you were leaving something behind. And as she looked at Jed, at the home they had built with their silent, calloused hands, she realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty that there was nothing here she wanted to leave. She had stumbled into this forgotten place as a last, desperate resort, and somewhere along the way, it had become the only place on earth she wanted to be. Home was not a town or a state. Home was a quiet man mending a fence under the hot afternoon sun. She walked out to him. The sound of her footsteps in the dust made him stop. He lowered the axe and leaned on it, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He looked at her, his blue eyes clear and steady. His face was unreadable, impassive. But she knew he was waiting. He was giving her the choice, his silence a gift of absolute, unconditional freedom. He had acknowledged Alistair's news with a single, brief nod. The decision was hers, and his face held no judgment, no plea, no expectation. She stopped a few feet from him. "He's gone," she said, her voice quiet. "Thorne, he can't hurt me anymore." Jed nodded once, his gaze never leaving hers. "I heard I could leave," she said, testing the words, feeling their weight. "I could go anywhere I wanted now." He nodded again. "You could." The world seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment. the pivot on which the rest of her life would turn. She looked into his eyes and saw her own reflection there. She saw the woman who had survived, the woman who had fought back, the woman who had healed a broken man and, in doing so, had healed herself. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The words were not a surrender. They were a declaration. They were the strongest, truest words she had ever spoken. A long, silent moment passed. A hawk circled high overhead. The sun beat down. Jedediah Callahan looked at the woman standing before him, the woman who had chosen this hard, lonely place over the entire world. A slow, almost imperceptible change occurred in his expression. The tension in his shoulders eased, the guarded watchfulness in his eyes softened, replaced by something deep and settled. He straightened up, taking the axe in his hand. He looked around at the small patch of land they had claimed from the wilderness, the cabin, the corral, the endless sky. He looked back at her, and the faintest hint of a smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. "Well then," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble, "we're going to need a chicken coop." The autumn rains came, washing the dust from the air and turning the desert landscape a deep, bruised purple. With the rains came the storms, great, violent squalls that rolled down from the mountains with the sound of 1,000 stampeding buffalo. They were a force of nature that demanded respect, a reminder of the wild, untamable power of the land they had chosen as their home. One night, such a storm descended upon them. It was a tempest of biblical proportions. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, a constant, mournful shriek that seemed to claw at the very foundations of the cabin. Rain came not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, hammering against the roof and walls. The world outside was a maelstrom of roaring wind and blinding flashes of lightning that momentarily bleached the landscape white, followed by claps of thunder so deep and loud they vibrated through the floorboards and into the bones. Inside, the cabin was a small, warm island of defiance in the heart of the storm. The fire Jed had built in the hearth burned bright and steady, its flames casting a warm, flickering amber light that pushed back against the raging darkness. The new door he had built held firm, the sturdy wooden latch secure. The walls, now properly chinked, kept the worst of the wind at bay. The sounds of the storm were still there, a constant, raging symphony, but they were muffled, distant. They were the sounds of a world outside, a world that could no longer touch them. Jed stood by the single window, its wooden shutter barred, listening to the fury of the storm. He was not troubled by it. He was a man who understood the violence of nature. It was the violence of men that had driven him into the wilderness. He was at peace here, in this small, sturdy box he had built, with the storm raging around him. He was no longer a wanderer. He was an anchor. Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup, watching him. In the months since the prospector's visit, a profound change had settled over them both. The last vestiges of the hunted girl had fallen away from her, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. Her hands were no longer soft and pale, but capable and calloused from work. Her face, framed by the warm firelight, held a deep, settled peace. She had stopped running, and in doing so, she had finally found herself. Jed, too, was a different man. The hard, remote shell he had worn as armor had softened. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet watchfulness that was protective, not fearful. He still spoke little, but his silences were no longer empty. They were filled with a comfortable, easy companionship. He would sometimes look at her when she was not aware, and his expression, in those unguarded moments, was one of pure, unadulterated wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe that this woman, this life, was real. She watched him now, his broad back to her, his profile a stoic silhouette against the fire-lit wall. She saw the familiar lines of his shoulders, the strength in his stillness. She thought of the journey that had brought them to this night, to this room, a desperate plea on a dusty trail, a frantic flight under a merciless sun, a shared, silent struggle for survival that had, against all odds, blossomed into this quiet, unshakable bond. They had never spoken the words. They had never needed to. Their love was not in promises, but in the daily, unspoken acts of care and partnership. It was in the solid walls of the cabin, in the warmth of the fire, in the shared bread on the table. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and a draft snaked across the floor, making the flames in the hearth dance and leap. Clara shivered, though not from the cold. It was a tremor of profound contentment, of a joy so deep it was almost painful. She looked over at the wooden hook by the door. Hanging there was Jed's duster coat. It was the first thing she had truly seen of him, the garment that had been her first sanctuary. It had shielded her from the eyes of her hunters. It had warmed her on cold nights. It was a symbol of his protection, of his quiet, steadfast strength. It had been the beginning of everything. She rose from her stool and went to the hook. She took the heavy canvas coat down. It was imbued with his scent leather, wood smoke, and the faint, clean smell of the desert after a rain. She walked to him, her footsteps silent on the floorboards. He turned as she approached, his blue eyes questioning in the dim light. She didn't speak. She simply unfolded the coat and, standing on her toes, draped it over his broad shoulders. It was a reversal of every time he had done the same for her. It was no longer the act of a protector shielding the vulnerable. It was an act of partnership, an offering of shared warmth against the storm, both outside and within. She was returning the comfort he had given her, a gesture that said, "We are equals. We shelter each other now." He stood perfectly still, the heavy coat settling around him. He looked down at her, his gaze intense. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with all the words they had never said, with the accumulated weight of their shared journey. The howling of the wind seemed to fade into a distant murmur. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the beating of her own heart. He slowly raised a hand, his rough, calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch that was infinitely tender, a question and an answer all in one. "Take it off," he murmured. His voice was a low, gravelly whisper, the same words that had been a hook to their story, now spoken with a completely different meaning. It was not a dismissal. It was an invitation. It was a quiet, intimate request to remove the last symbolic barrier between them. He was not the protector anymore, and she was not the one in need of shelter. They were just a man and a woman. A slow smile touched Clara's lips. She understood. She reached up and slid the heavy coat from his shoulders. But she did not put it on herself. Its purpose as a shield was finished, with a deliberate, final grace. She turned and hung the coat back on its hook by the door. It was an artifact of their past, a story that had been told. A new story was about to begin. She turned back to him. The firelight danced in her eyes, turning them into deep, fathomless pools. She looked up at him, her gaze direct, fearless, and filled with a love that was as wild and as powerful as the storm raging outside. She took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She reached up, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palms. Then she looked into his eyes, and with a voice that was clear and steady and filled with all the certainty in the world, she whispered, "Lock the door." He stared at her for a heart-stopping moment, a universe of understanding passing between them. Then he nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. He turned and walked to the door he had built with his own hands. He slid the heavy, hand-carved wooden latch into place. The sound was not a click, but a solid, satisfying thunk, a sound of finality, a sound of absolute security. The storm howled. The rain lashed against the walls. The wind shrieked its lonely, wild song. But inside the small cabin, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warm, dancing light of the fire, the profound, peaceful silence, and the two solitary souls who had weathered their own storms and had, at long last, found their way home. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to share this experience with you. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit that hype button to help us share these tales with more people just like you.